They say a man's mother and wife are the two women he can trust the most. I believed that with all my heart. My mother raised me alone after my father passed away, and I owed everything to her. She was my rock. And my wife, she was my soulmate, the woman I thought I'd spend forever with. If someone had told me that these two, the people I loved most, would betray me in the worst way possible, I would have laughed in their face. But life has a cruel way of proving you wrong. Back then, I was blind. I saw my mother and wife as my greatest supporters, always by my side. I worked hard to provide for them, thinking we were all a team. My wife and my mother had an unusually close bond, and I considered myself lucky. They spent hours together, sharing secrets, laughing over coffee, and even shopping for gifts to surprise me. I thought it was love. I thought it was family. I had no idea that their bond was built on lies. I never imagined that while I was out working late, my wife was sneaking around with another man, and my mother knew about it. Worse, she helped hide it from me. I was living in a house of deception, and I was the fool who thought it was a home. But the truth always finds its way out. And when it did, it shattered everything. Looking back, the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. It started with little things, things most people would overlook. My wife's phone, which used to sit carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always face down or clutched tightly in her hand. She started dressing up more, even when she was just running errands. And the biggest change, the way she looked at me. The warmth in her eyes was fading, replaced by something distant, something cold. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Stress from work was probably making me paranoid. But then, I started noticing something else. My mother's strange behavior. She had always been protective of me, but now, whenever I mentioned my wife acting different, she would shut me down. "You're overthinking," she'd say, waving a hand dismissively. "She loves you. Stop being insecure." Her words should have reassured me, but they didn't. Instead, they left an uneasy feeling in my gut, like I was missing something right in front of me. One night, I woke up thirsty and walked past the living room. That's when I heard it, low voices, urgent whispers. I froze. It was my wife and my mother. I couldn't make out their words, but their hushed, serious tones sent a chill down my spine. My mother's voice was firm, as if she was giving instructions. My wife sounded nervous. Then silence. A few seconds later, my mother walked into the hallway and nearly jumped when she saw me. "You scared me," she said with a nervous chuckle. "What are you doing up?" I stared at her. Something about the way she looked at me, like she was guarding a secret, made my stomach tighten. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "What were you two talking about?" My mother's smile never wavered. "Oh, just family stuff. Nothing important." I glanced toward the living room. My wife was already gone, as if she had vanished the moment I got too close. Something wasn't right. I just didn't know how deep the betrayal ran yet. The more I questioned things, the more my mother defended my wife. And the more she defended her, the more I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried to brush off that night, the hushed whispers, the nervous glances, but it clung to me like a shadow. Something was wrong and I needed answers. So one evening I decided to test the waters. "Mom," I said casually over dinner, "do you think my wife has been acting different lately?" I expected her to ask why, maybe even joke about how all marriages go through phases. But instead, her reaction was sharp, too sharp. She put down her fork and scoffed. "What kind of question is that?" I hesitated. "I don't know. She seems distracted, secretive, even." My mother let out a short laugh. "Oh, come on. She's probably just busy. Or maybe you're not paying enough attention to her." That hit me wrong. Not paying enough attention? I frowned. "Mom, I work my ass off to give her a good life." Her expression softened, but there was something behind her eyes. Something calculating. "I'm just saying, sometimes men assume the worst when the real problem is that their wife needs more affection." It was such a strange thing to say. Such a defensive thing to say. I didn't press further that night, but I started watching more closely. And the more I paid attention, the more her behavior became suspicious. Anytime I brought up my wife's odd behavior, my mother was immediately on the defensive. Stop overanalyzing everything. She's your wife. Trust her. You're being paranoid. Felt like she was shutting me down before I could even think. And then, one day, I made an offhand comment about hiring a private investigator, just a joke to test her reaction. My mother went pale. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She quickly forced a laugh. "Oh, honey, don't be ridiculous. You don't need to waste money on that nonsense." That's when I knew. She wasn't just defending my wife. She was hiding something. Doubt had been gnawing at me for weeks, but that moment, seeing the fear in my mother's eyes, was the first time I knew, without a doubt, that something was deeply wrong. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I played along. I pretended to let it go, nodded as if I believed her, and carried on like nothing had changed. But everything had. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept racing back to every time my mother had dismissed my concerns, every excuse she had made for my wife. It all pointed to one thing. She knew something, and whatever it was, she didn't want me to find out. I needed proof. So, I started paying closer attention, not just to my wife, but to my mother as well. Their conversations, their body language, their reactions whenever I walked into a room. And that's when I saw it. One evening, as I stepped into the living room, my wife was already there, sitting with my mother on the couch. The second I appeared, the air between them shifted. My mother smiled, but it was too quick, too forced. My wife, on the other hand, looked like she had just been caught doing something she shouldn't. The room felt tense. I pretended not to notice. "Hey, what are you two talking about?" "Nothing important," my mother said almost too quickly. "Just catching up." My wife barely looked at me. "Yeah, just random things." That was the first crack. They were slipping. I sat down across from them, keeping my voice casual. "Oh, random things like what?" My mother gave me a look, the kind that said, "Drop it. Just life, dear." But my wife, she wouldn't meet my eyes. She played with the hem of her shirt, her breathing just a little too fast. I knew that look. Guilt. That was the moment I realized something else. My mother wasn't just covering for her. She was coaching her, telling her what to say, teaching her how to keep me in the dark. And that was the moment I decided I wasn't going to be in the dark anymore. Once I saw the crack, I couldn't unsee it. My mother and my wife were hiding something, and no matter how hard they tried to cover it up, little clues kept slipping through. I just had to follow the breadcrumbs. The first one came the very next morning. I left for work like usual, but doubled back a few minutes later, pretending I had forgotten my phone. As I stepped through the door, I heard my wife's voice, low and urgent. "He's getting suspicious." I froze. Then came my mother's voice, just as hushed. "Calm down. Just stick to the plan." "The plan?" I clenched my jaw and stepped into the kitchen like I hadn't heard a thing. The second they saw me, they jumped. My wife nearly dropped her coffee. My mother plastered on a smile. "You're back already?" she asked, voice just a little too cheerful. "Forgot my phone," I said, grabbing it off the counter. I locked eyes with my wife, and for the first time I saw fear. Not guilt. Fear. That was breadcrumb number one. The next came a few days later. I started paying attention to my wife's habits, her schedule, the way she always had an excuse for staying out late. One evening, I casually asked where she had been. "Ran errands with your mom," she said without hesitation. But when I asked my mom the same question an hour later, she barely hesitated before saying, "Oh, we were at a cafe. Just chatting." Except when I asked which cafe, she paused. Just for a second. But it was enough. She fumbled, said some name I'd never heard before. That was breadcrumb number two. Then the big one. One night, while my wife was in the shower, I saw her phone light up. A message from an unsaved number. "Tomorrow, same place. Be careful." My blood turned to ice. I copied the number down, took a deep breath, and made a decision. I wasn't going to ask anymore. I wasn't going to drop hints or play dumb. I was going to follow the breadcrumbs all the way to the truth. I told myself I was ready for the truth, that whatever I found, I could handle it. I was wrong. The next day, I left work early and followed the number from my wife's message. I had tracked it to a small cafe on the other side of town, far from where we lived, far from where we ever went together. And that's where I saw them, my wife and him. They sat in a corner, heads close together, whispering like two people who had everything to lose. She laughed at something he said, the same laugh that used to be just for me. My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe they were just friends, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But then he reached for her hand, and she let him. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I snapped a picture, not for revenge, not for proof, but because part of me still couldn't believe it. My wife, the woman I loved, sitting across from another man, holding his hand like I didn't exist. And then the final blow. As I stood there, hidden behind the cafe's glass, my mother walked in. She didn't look surprised to see them. She smiled. And worse, she sat down at their table like she had done it 100 times before. I felt something inside me break. She wasn't just covering for my wife. She was part of it. I thought back to every time she defended my wife. Every excuse, every lie, every time she told me I was overthinking. She had been gaslighting me, betraying me, my own mother. I walked away, feeling nothing but numbness. The kind that comes when you realize your whole world has been built on a lie. But numbness doesn't last forever. Soon it would turn into something else. Rage. That night, I sat at the dining table, staring at my wife as she scrolled through her phone, acting like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't sneaking off to meet another man, like my own mother hadn't been sitting there, supporting her betrayal. My fists clenched under the table. My heartbeat was a war drum in my chest. I had imagined this moment 100 times on the drive home, but now that it was here, the words felt too small for the pain inside me. I took a slow breath and said, "Where were you today?" She barely looked up. "Running errands." Lies. Again. I leaned forward. "Try again." This time her eyes flickered, just for a second. She forced a casual shrug. "What's with the third degree?" "I was with your mom." I let the silence stretch. Then, I pulled out my phone, turned it toward her, and let her see the photo. The moment her eyes landed on it, her whole body went rigid. Her face drained of color. Her fingers trembled. And for the first time, she had no words. I felt the rage crawl up my throat, but I forced it down. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to let her twist this. So I asked, as calmly as I could, "How long?" She swallowed hard. "It's not what it looks like." I laughed. A hollow, bitter sound. "That's the best you've got?" Her lips parted, searching for another lie, another excuse. Then something changed. Her shoulders slumped, her mask cracked, and with a quiet, broken voice, she whispered, 6 months. I clenched my jaw so tight it hurt. 6 months. Half a year. Half a year of lies, of betrayal, of her coming home to me like nothing had changed. I should have felt relief that she finally admitted it. Instead, all I felt was rage. Cold, burning, rage. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, my mother walked in. The door creaked open, and there she was, my mother. She stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and guilt. But it didn't fool me. I knew her too well. She had already made her choice. I turned to her slowly, the pain of what I had just learned weighing down on me like a ton of bricks. "You knew, didn't you?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes darted to my wife, then back to me. I didn't want to say anything," she mumbled, her voice weak, like she was trying to justify it. "You didn't want to say anything? You let me live in the dark while both of you were lying to me." I shouted, my voice cracking. The anger boiled over, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. Her face twisted with guilt, but she didn't speak up. "I trusted you." I let the words hang in the air, thick with pain. "I trusted both of you, and you both betrayed me." My wife sat there in silence, not meeting my eyes. It felt like the entire world was closing in on me, suffocating me in a fog of betrayal and confusion. But I couldn't stop. I needed answers. "Why?" I turned to my mother, my voice shaking with disbelief. Why would you do this to me? She hesitated, a long pause that felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I thought you'd never understand. She was so unhappy. I just wanted her to be happy. My own mother had helped my wife destroy our marriage. I looked at my wife, her face pale and hollow, the reality of what she had done sinking in. Happy? I scoffed. You think this is happiness? Destroying everything I've worked for? Betraying me like this? My mother shifted uneasily. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought you wouldn't notice. I thought I could keep you both safe. I stared at her, feeling the walls of my world crumble around me. I had built everything I had for my family, for her, and she had torn it down from the inside out. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, in the stillness of the room, I made my decision. I was done. Done with the lies. Done with the betrayal. Done with both of them. My voice came out cold, steady, and full of finality. I'm done. Both of you can leave. Now. They didn't argue. They knew there was nothing left to say. And as my mother walked out the door, head low, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for me to heal from a betrayal like this. Especially when the ones who hurt you the most are the ones you loved the most. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. I'd rebuild, and I'd do it without them. The door closed behind my mother, the soft click echoing in the hollow space of the house that no longer felt like home. I stood there, numb, staring at the spot where she had stood just moments ago. She was gone, but the question still lingered. Why, Mom? Why did you betray me? Why did you choose her, the woman who destroyed everything, over your own son? The silence in the room was suffocating. It felt like the air itself had thickened, as if the house had turned against me. My wife sat there, avoiding my gaze, the weight of her guilt hanging heavy between us. She didn't speak. What could she say? I didn't want to look at her. I didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. I needed answers, but they weren't going to come from her. It was only my mother who could explain this. So I picked up the phone. I dialed her number with a trembling hand. The phone rang once, twice, and then she picked up. Hello? Her voice was hesitant, as if she knew what was coming. Why, Mom? I whispered, my voice breaking. Why did you do this? To me? To your own son? There was a long pause on the other end. I could almost hear her trying to gather her thoughts, trying to find words that would make this make sense. But there were no words. Finally, she spoke. I thought it was for the best. Her voice was quiet, almost too soft to hear. She was lost, and I thought maybe you weren't the one who could fix her. She needed someone who understood her. So you chose her over me? The anger rose in my chest, sharp and cutting. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. She was so unhappy. I thought maybe she just needed to be free. Free from the pressure of being your wife. Couldn't believe it. She wasn't just justifying her actions. She was justifying my wife's betrayal. The woman who had been my partner, my love, the one I had built everything with. You betrayed me for her happiness? What about me, Mom? What about your own son? Where was my happiness? There was another long silence. I knew she didn't have an answer. Finally, I heard her voice crack, a sob that broke through the years of secrets and lies. I never wanted to hurt you, but you were so blind to what was happening. I didn't want you to hate her. I didn't want to lose you both. My heart ached with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I had loved her so much. She was supposed to protect me, but she had let me drown in my own misery. I don't need your protection, I said, my voice cold now. What I needed was the truth. But you didn't give me that, did you, Mom? You lied. You chose her over me. I'm so sorry, she whispered, the words too late. I never meant for any of this to happen. I squeezed my eyes shut, the tears I had been holding back threatening to spill. This wasn't the woman who had raised me, the one I had trusted with my life. She was gone now, just like my wife. And in that moment, I realized something that broke me. I would never be able to trust either of them again. I was alone. The days after that phone call felt like a blur. My mind spinning, trying to process the betrayal that had come from both the woman I had loved and the woman who had brought me into this world. I couldn't trust either of them anymore, and the weight of that realization left me hollow inside. I tried to focus on the daily grind, to distract myself from the chaos swirling around me. But every time I looked around, I was reminded of the life I had built, the family I thought I had. The house was too quiet, and the memories felt like ghosts, haunting me at every turn. But it wasn't just the silence that rattled me. It was the truth that I was still piecing together. And as much as I tried to block it out, something was gnawing at me. There was more to the story, something deeper that I hadn't uncovered yet. One afternoon, as I was sifting through some old paperwork, just trying to keep my mind busy, I stumbled across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a letter from my mother. It was addressed to her. I couldn't breathe as I opened it, the words on the page like a slap to my face. It was full of apologies to my wife, apologies for the way things had gone, for the way I had treated her. But the part that cut deepest was at the end, where my mother admitted something I hadn't even considered. "I know what you're going through. I understand your pain. I've been there too. You didn't betray him, you just had to do what was right for you. And now we both have to find a way to heal." My stomach turned. It was clear now, my mother wasn't just protecting my wife. She was part of it all along. They had been working together, manipulating me, playing me for a fool. Couldn't believe it. My mother wasn't just hiding my wife's affair. She had been encouraging it, covering it up, and feeding her lies. I had been living in a house built on deception, and they had both played their parts. I slammed the letter down on the table, anger rising within me like a tidal wave. How could she do this? How could she be so complicit in destroying my life? I had trusted her above everyone else. She was supposed to be my rock. But instead, she had been a part of the double betrayal that had shattered everything I knew. And then, as if that wasn't enough to completely break me, I found something else. A picture of my wife and my mother smiling together, standing side by side, at some sort of gathering. My mother had been hiding something far darker than I had ever imagined. She wasn't just shielding my wife from my anger. She was in on the betrayal from the start. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was a conspiracy. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. The betrayal stung, but more than that, I realized something else. I wasn't just a victim. I was a pawn in their game. They had used me, manipulated me, and now, with everything I thought I knew falling apart around me, I was faced with a painful choice. Keep playing their game or fight back and expose the truth. And for the first time in my life, I was done being their pawn. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a simmering rage that I could no longer ignore. It was like a fire had been lit inside me, and now it burned with the need for justice. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming my life. I sat alone in the living room, the darkness outside mirroring the chaos inside me. The house felt colder now, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, reminding me that it wasn't the place I once knew. It was a battlefield. I had two choices. I could sit back and let my mother and wife continue with their lies, or I could fight back. I had already lost my trust in them, but what else could they take from me? It was time to start thinking strategically. If they thought they could break me, they were wrong. I pulled out my phone and opened up the Notes app, beginning to jot down everything I had discovered over the past few days. The letter, the photo, the subtle hints my mother had dropped during our conversations. Nothing they had done was going to be overlooked, but I had to be careful. My mother and wife were both master manipulators, always one step ahead. They had no idea how much I knew, and I planned to keep it that way. For now. First, I needed more evidence. They thought they could hide the truth from me, but there was always a way to uncover it. I knew my wife's schedule like the back of my hand. I had been the one who noticed when she was distant, when she wasn't herself. I had been the one who tried to fix things to save us. But now I was going to use that same knowledge against her. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my closest friends. It was better to keep this to myself for now, to make sure no one would warn her. I had to play this carefully. I took a deep breath and opened up my calendar app. There were places I had to go, people I needed to see. I was going to get the truth, and I was going to make sure my mother and wife paid for what they had done. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to show them how it felt to be betrayed, just like I had been. It was time to make them regret ever crossing me. As the days passed, I found myself tracking every move they made, every phone call, every message. Nothing could slip past me. I was meticulous, calculated, and I was ready to strike. I knew the next step would require patience. The perfect opportunity would come, and when it did, I would be ready. I was no longer the victim. I was the one in control now, and nothing would stop me from getting the justice I deserved. The days felt like they dragged on, each one heavier than the last. I kept to myself, quietly observing their every move. My wife, oblivious to the storm I was brewing, continued with her life as if nothing had changed. She didn't know that the truth was closing in on her like a vice, and soon it would crush her. My mother, ever the master of manipulation, stayed in her own world, convinced she was untouchable. She thought she had me fooled, but I was done being a fool. I had collected every piece of evidence, every subtle hint, every scrap of information I could find. It was all leading to this moment, the moment when everything would be exposed, the moment when they would have to face the consequences of their betrayal. I wasn't going to just confront them. No, that would have been too easy. They had manipulated me for so long. It was time to turn the tables. I arranged everything meticulously, just like I had planned. I made sure the room was set up just right, everything in place for the revelation that would destroy their world. The plan was simple. I was going to expose them, not just to me, but to everyone. I waited for the perfect moment. It had to be when my wife and mother would be together, when they would least expect it. I had set everything up in the background, my phone, my camera ready to capture the moment. Then it happened. The text message came at exactly the right time. My wife sent a message to my mother, something innocuous at first glance. But I knew better. The tone was different now, less guarded. They had stopped pretending. They were too comfortable with their lies. That was the moment. I turned on the camera, hidden in plain sight, and caught every word they said. The recording captured the weight of their betrayal, their casual disregard for the pain they'd caused. My mother, defending my wife's actions like they were justified, speaking as if she were the one who had been hurt all along. My wife claiming I would never find out, assuming her affair was a secret, protected by the walls they had built together. As I watched them, my blood boiled. How could they have been so arrogant, so callous? They were both guilty of betraying me, of destroying the trust one had given them. But now they were going to face the truth. I called them into the living room where I had set everything up. The tension in the air was palpable as I watched them walk in, unsuspecting. They had no idea what was coming. I played the recording. The words echoed through the room, each one landing like a punch. The shock on their faces was priceless, and in that moment, I felt a rush of power. For once, I wasn't the one who was blind. I had the truth. My wife was the first to speak, her voice trembling. I didn't know you knew." My mother stood frozen, her face pale as the walls she had carefully built around her crumbled. She didn't have a single word to say, her guilt written all over her face. And in that silence, I realized something. This moment, this exposure, wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't about making them suffer the way I had suffered. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my trust, my life. They had both chosen to betray me, and now they would have to live with the consequences of their actions. But even as I stood there, watching their world collapse around them, I couldn't help but wonder, what would become of me? I had destroyed the life I knew, but in its place I had nothing. I couldn't undo the damage, but I could walk away, and that's exactly what I did. I left. The house that had once been filled with love and laughter was now just a memory. I wasn't going to wait for their apologies or their excuses. I was done. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. The moment they realized the extent of their betrayal, their shocked faces, none of it gave me the relief I had been expecting. It was like I had stripped away the mask they wore, but behind it, there was nothing but emptiness. I had exposed them, but in doing so, I had exposed something within myself too. A part of me had died that day, maybe not literally, but emotionally. There was no going back to the man I was before. That man was gone. But revenge had a way of gnawing at the soul. It wasn't enough just to confront them. That was too easy, too quick. No, the real satisfaction came from letting them think they were safe, letting them live in the shadow of uncertainty, wondering when the next blow would come. Revenge, I realized, was best served cold. I kept my distance. I didn't need to speak to them again. I let them stew in their guilt. I didn't need to see their faces or hear their apologies. I didn't want any of it. What I wanted was for them to feel the consequences of their actions, the consequences of thinking they could manipulate me, deceive me, tear my world apart without paying a price. I watched from a distance as their lives began to unravel. My wife, the woman who had once been my everything, began to crumble under the weight of her lies. She tried to patch things up with me, sending messages, trying to meet, but I ignored every attempt. She was nothing but a memory now. Every time she reached out, it only reminded me of how deeply she had hurt me. I didn't want her back. Not now. Not ever. My mother, on the other hand, tried to justify her actions. She called, she cried, and she begged me to understand. But no apology would ever fix the damage they had done. I let her suffer in silence, watching as her guilt slowly consumed her. The woman who had once been my rock, my protector, had become a shadow of herself, and I couldn't care less. The real sting came when the world found out. I didn't just expose them to me, I exposed them to everyone. I made sure the details of their affair, how it had started, how long it had been going on, spread like wildfire. I didn't care about the fallout anymore. They had brought it on themselves. People close to me, friends I thought I could trust, began distancing themselves from both of them. The consequences of their actions were far-reaching. My wife lost her reputation, her friends, her status. My mother, once revered in the community, now found herself alone, abandoned by everyone she thought would stand by her. But I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. Instead, I felt a cold emptiness, like a void that refused to be filled. My revenge had worked, but it hadn't healed the wounds. Nothing could undo the pain they had caused. I had been willing to destroy everything to make them pay. But now that they were broken, I realized it didn't bring me peace. It just left me with more questions. Questions I didn't have answers to. What was the point of it all? I had won the battle, but in doing so, I had lost a part of myself. So I left, again. This time, not just from the house, but from everything. I packed up my things, left the town that had been my home for years, and moved far away. I needed to start over. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my past. The house, the memories, the betrayal, they were all behind me now. I had gotten my revenge, but at what cost? The price of freedom was far greater than I had ever imagined. Starting over wasn't as simple as packing up and moving. It wasn't just about a change of scenery. It was about rebuilding something that had been shattered into so many pieces. I didn't even know where to begin. When I arrived in the new town, it felt like I was stepping into a different life. One I hadn't planned for, but one I desperately needed. The quiet streets, the unfamiliar faces. It was all so foreign to me, but in that strangeness, I found a kind of comfort. There was no one here who knew me, no one who knew my past. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts, a place that seemed as broken as I felt inside. But that was okay. I wasn't looking for perfection. I wasn't even looking for happiness. I was just trying to survive the aftermath of everything. The first few days were the hardest. I woke up in the morning, made coffee, and stared out the window, unsure of what to do next. The weight of what had happened still clung to me, like a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. It felt as though the betrayal was still fresh, still raw. I didn't want to reach out to anyone. I didn't want to talk about the past. Every time I thought about it, a deep ache filled my chest. But I couldn't ignore the fact that I was lonely. I had isolated myself, pushed everyone away. Friends, family, even the idea of finding someone new. It was a defense mechanism, I suppose. Trust had become a foreign concept. But as time passed, something shifted. Slowly, I began to engage with the world again. It started with simple things. A coffee shop down the street, a walk in the park, casual conversations with strangers that didn't judge me. And little by little, I started to feel like the man I used to be, or at least a version of him. I knew the road to healing wasn't going to be fast or easy. I knew I couldn't fix everything at once. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over something. The pieces of my broken life, scattered across time and memory, had started to come back together. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't erase the betrayal. But I could choose to move forward. I could choose to make my life better, to find meaning in the little things again. I started to look for new purpose. I began working on a project I had always dreamed of. Something that would give me focus, something that was entirely mine. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about finding my own peace, even if it meant walking down a lonely road. The phone calls stopped coming. My wife's desperate pleas, my mother's cries. They no longer reached me. It was as if they had faded into the background, and I was left with the quiet hum of my own thoughts. It was hard, but I knew it was the only way forward. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And with each step I took, no matter how small, I felt like I was getting closer to the person I wanted to be. It wasn't easy, but I wasn't going to let the past define me anymore. I was determined to rebuild. Not for them, not for anyone, but for myself. I had been through the worst. Now, it was time to rebuild the best version of myself. And that journey, though uncertain, was mine to take. The more time passed, the more I wondered, what did I really want? Was I seeking justice? Was I hoping to see them suffer for what they'd done to me? Or was it something deeper? Something I couldn't even name that I was chasing? I had thought I wanted revenge. At first, it felt like the only way to get back at the people who had destroyed everything I had believed in. But now, sitting alone in my apartment, in a life that was mine and mine alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe what I was really after wasn't revenge at all. Maybe it was closure. I didn't know what justice would look like anymore. I had hurt them, sure, but I had also hurt myself in the process. In the end, nothing was truly won. They had lost their reputations, their friends, their families. Yet I was still carrying around this weight. It didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow. But closure? Closure was different. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about punishing them anymore. It was about me, freeing myself from the chains that had bound me to my past. Over time, I stopped asking myself what they deserved. I started asking what I deserved. What was going to bring me peace? The answer came slowly, quietly, but with certainty. Forgiveness. Not for them. For me. I didn't have to forgive them to move on. But I had to stop letting their actions control me. I had to stop letting them take up space in my heart, in my thoughts. It was time to let go of the bitterness, the anger that had fueled me for so long. It was time to reclaim my life. Not for them, but for myself. I didn't reach out to my wife or my mother. I didn't need to. I wasn't going to get closure from them. I had to create it myself. And so I did. I chose to walk away from the past and into a future where I wasn't defined by what they had done. Justice might be out of my hands, but closure, that was mine to take. And with it came the power to decide what the rest of my life would look like. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even what I thought I wanted. But it was mine. And that was enough. So what about you? Do you think justice can truly bring closure? Or is forgiveness the key to moving on? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've found strength in your own journey, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and survival.